The job of the blender is to combine these elements in such a way as to produce an overall flavour.
A wider repertoire of different beverages than ever before.
I think one of the most interesting breweries, and certainly one of the most interesting origin stories for a brewery in Australia.
Single malts, blends, grain whiskies, bourbons and more.
If you want mezcal to be sold around the world, then unfortunately you're going to have to make a compromise.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Glaetzer-Dixon Family Wines made history in 2011 when it became the first Tasmanian winery to win the Jimmy Watson, Australia's most prestigious wine prize, at the Royal Melbourne Wine Awards. Winemaker Nick Glaetzer has been celebrating the milestone with a highly limited museum release of his winning wine, the 2010 Mon Pere Shiraz. And he joins us today on the Drinks Adventures podcast. He'll update you on other recent happenings at Glaetzer-Dixon, which planted a new 12-hectare vineyard in the Coal River Valley in 2018 and is currently preparing to release new vintages of La Judith Pinot Noir, named for Nick's mother, who sadly passed away in 2014. First up though, I asked Nick about the significance of that Jimmy Watson award, both for him and the Tasmanian wine industry generally.
Well, 2 points there. It was Tasmanian and it was Tasmanian Shiraz. It was pretty huge. I mean, it was huge for me, being a relatively new, younger winemaker and having, my own little tiny brand entering into the massive Melbourne wine show, traditionally dominated by the big corporates. So to have a little Tassie producer, totally left of field, it was big news down here. And I think it was pretty big on the mainland as well.
Yeah, I mean, because that particular prize, it would have generally been dominated by sort of, bigger, richer styles of Australian red wine.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the big stars out of South Australia, occasional years from Victoria and Western Australia. But yeah, you're definitely right, those bigger, richer styles. I guess back in 2010, it was sort of a changing of attitudes in the wine world, particularly the Melbourne Wine Show, new judges, new chairs coming along. And I guess they made a point to not miss out on perhaps the more delicate styles of reds that Australia's producing. I wouldn't want to criticise the judges before that. I mean, that was just what they were trained to sort of pick up on. It was, I've judged in wine shows before also, and you've got, those big, massive wines that come ahead of you and you're like, right, well, this is pretty intense, so I'm going to give it a higher points than the wine next to it, which isn't as intense. You've got 10 seconds to look at a wine and it's whatever speaks to you in those 10 seconds. So I guess it's what you've been trained to do. But you're right. I think at that stage, the chair was asking the judges to perhaps, concentrate a bit further behind, the initial impression.
Take me back. Tell me your thinking about what you sort of saw that the opportunity was to make a unique expression of Tassie Shiraz.
So when I moved down to Tassie, I came down here for Pinot. I mean, Tassie in my eyes is the best place in Australia to do Pinot just because it's so bloody cold. And then I was working at Frogmore Creek with Alain Rousseau, and he's still the winemaker there, and he was involved with Morilla in the mid-90s, and he'd made some Shiraz from their St. Matthias vineyard up in the Tamar Valley, which I got to see probably 2005, 2006, and it really reminded me of the Rhone Valley. Those charcuterie notes and the white pepper, and it was just, it sort of blew my mind. I came in here for Pinot and to see that there was Shiraz so similar to the French version of it. So that's sort of what I had in my head. I knew I wasn't going to make anything like from the mainland, that we just, when you're picking in late April, early May, there's no chance you're going to get those big, juicy, juby, big tannin flavours. So when I was working at Frogmore, we had a number of contract clients that we were making wines for, and a few of those had little plantings of Shiraz. And often those growers, they were a bit tired at the end of the season. We'd pick their Riesling and their Chardonnay and their Pinot, and then we're trying to tell them to wait another 4 or 5 weeks for their Shiraz to ripen. They wanted to go on holiday. So often they'd go, bugger it, we've got our mates coming this weekend, we're picking irrespective that it's, 10 and a half, 11 and a half Beaumet. So that fruit would come in and, would make greenish sort of insipid Shiraz out of it. Sometimes they'd make sparkling Shiraz out of it, thinking, along the lines of, well, we pick our sparkling Pinot and sparkling Chardonnay at 10 Beaumet. Why can't we do that with sparkling Shiraz? So a lot of those growers were, when I came along and said, I'm quite keen to buy your Shiraz, they were quite keen to hand it over to me. But I did stipulate, you've got to hang it out there just a bit longer for me. So that was my thinking. 2008, first year, was probably, the wine was probably a little simple. It didn't have quite as long time on skins during ferment. It was racked pretty soon after Malo and barrel, no whole bunch involved. It was a filtered wine. So it had, I could see the beginnings of what I wanted, but it just missed out on that mid-texture palate that I'd so often seen from the Rhone Valley. So then from sort of 2009, 10 onwards, I started playing around with more whole bunch and stalk inclusion, spending a bit longer in oak and, utilising lees and barrel, that sort of stuff. And I guess by 2010, I'd sort of cracked it.
Yeah, and you were good enough to send me a bottle of the 2010, which is, I think, holding up still really nicely. Still some good tannin structure there and looks like it's got a few years ahead of it yet.
I think so, yeah. We did a vertical here at the winery, about 3 or 4 weeks ago with Curly Hassam Coates from Vintage Tasmania. And she was, I hadn't seen a lot of those wines, side by side for a long time. And it was pretty amazing to see the freshness, 10, 11, 12-year-old Tassie Shiraz that even I thought they would look a little more mature than they were. They were still super bright. And
you were saying that you knew you weren't going to be making anything like a mainland Shiraz, but then obviously on the mainland, if we look to Adelaide Hills or Canberra or Great Southern, for example, are all making some pretty awesome cool climate Shiraz. Where would you sort of position, the style that you're making in Tassie versus those other cooler regions?
Yeah, I think we're on our own. Those guys are still picking early to mid-April. We're harvesting sometimes in the middle of May. I think our fruit's just a little more delicate down here than even, I love the wines out of Canberra and the Great Southern. And I don't think I'd be able to make wines of that power down here yet. Possibly the Coal Valley, 10, 15, 20 years. We'll look into that. I'm half thinking about purchasing some Viognier next vintage.
I was going to come to Viognier because it seems to make sense with all the talk about the Rhone.
Yeah, well, the 2010, 2011, I think possibly 2013 was the last year that I trialled. I incorporated a bit of Pinot Gris instead of Viognier because that was all we could get down here. And that worked really well. You get that plushness of palate and the bright aromatics without the stone fruit character that Viognier can sometimes impart. But there's a vineyard that's just been planted down the road from us in Tea Tree in the Coal Valley that they've got some Viognier in. And I'm kind of keen, maybe just for a different label, just give it a crack, try and emulate some of the those great wines out of Canberra.
Now, maybe still on the Mon Pere, you just mentioned that you've done that vertical. What's been the sort of evolution since you've been making that wine?
So the fruit source is probably the biggest thing that's changed. Being in Tassie with tiny little vineyards, my access to those vineyards comes and goes. I've stuck with Meadowbank Vineyard all this time. I used to source from Pooley Wines before Anna moved back to Tassie to take over the reins. And they're making great Shiraz out of that block now. There's a couple of vineyards up in the Tamar Valley that I've used occasionally when they've had a bit of spare fruit. There was a vineyard in the Coal Valley that I used to use every year until Tolpuddle bought that last year, so that fruit is no longer available, unfortunately. But luckily our own vines, they'll be coming on stream next year, so our Coal Valley component will we'll only go a few years without having that in our blend. So that's probably been the biggest change. Vintage variation is also massive. The amount of stalk and whole bunch inclusion varies depending on the year. So cooler year like this year where we harvested, end of the first week of May, I didn't do any whole bunch and it was only sort of 10% stalks put back into the ferment to give it a bit of structure. Then we go back to years like 17, a reasonably warm year. I'm using, 25, 30% whole bunch and up to 50% store conclusion. Fruit source, probably the biggest change in what the wines have been doing, and then also that, the vintage variation that we have.
Now, you mentioned that you've acquired your own vineyard in the Coal River Valley, and it's at Tea Tree. We had Samantha Connew on last season, so that's in her neck of the woods, isn't it?
That's right, yep. So Sam's just the valley over. She's on Back Tea Tree Road. We're on Middle Tea Tree Road. So, similar sort of conditions to what Sam's got. It's a warmer part of the Coal Valley, which is still pretty cold, but it's a nice and dry spot. The area we are, average is about 500 mils of rainfall a year, so it's pretty dry. So disease pressure, is super low. We have to irrigate though. When we planted in 2018, that got followed up with a year. I think we got 340 mils of rain that following season. So not the best conditions for the year after you plant. But we used a rootstock, which is a drought-resistant rootstock. So I'm hoping that has, got the roots down nice and deep, and we'll be able to withstand any future seasons that pop up like that. Yeah, so we bought it's about a 40-hectare farm. We planted it with 12 hectares of vines 3 years ago. Half of it to Pinot, of course. 1/3 to Shiraz, which is 4 hectares. I think makes it the biggest single Shiraz vineyard in Tassie. Again, not by mainland standards, and then we put in a bit of Riesling to complement it.
You mentioned that the increased area that is planted to Shiraz in Tassie, is that sort of been something that has flown on from what people have seen, what you managed to do with your wines?
I think that put the seed in a few people's heads. A lot of the cellar doors 10 years ago in Tassie, they had their Pinot and they had Cabernet, but they would always get tourists coming down to Tassie. The tourists 10, 15 years ago just wanted, Cabernet or Shiraz. So these winemakers are like, well, we've got our Pinot here. That's what Tassie's known for. We do have some Cabernet, and they're like, oh, it's a bit green. So Shiraz, they saw that, that was getting recognition on the mainland. So they've put some of that in. I think times have changed though now. People are coming to Tassie to search out Pinot. They're not too phased if there's nothing but Pinot on the list. I think people that just want to have a bit of diversity in their portfolio have been putting some Shiraz in. You've got Claudio Redenti at Freycinet. He bought the Cumen vineyard about 7 or 8 years ago, which came with a small planting of Shiraz. He wanted to extend that based on what I'd done, so he'd put in another hectare, I think. Steve Ljubljana's put some in as well. A few people on the East Coast. The sort of warmer sites in Tassie, guys are having a crack at it, definitely. Since 2010, I think we've gone up from sort of 5 hectares to, we're getting close to 20 hectares of Shiraz planted in Tassie. So that's massive numbers. But compared to, 1,500 hectares all up to, we must be getting close to 3,000 hectares now. It's still a drop in, it's only a little pond down here, but it's still pretty tiny. Doesn't barely rates a mention on any sort of data.
Now, you haven't followed some of your industry counterparts by labelling this cooler climate style as a Syrah. Tell me, versus Shiraz, tell me your thoughts on that sort of trend.
So, as you know, I grew up in the Barossa Valley where my great-great-great-grandparents, Charles and Martha Masters, planted Shiraz vines back in the 1850s, and then the Glaetzers came along in the 1880s to the Barossa, worked with Shiraz vines. It's bad enough for me to be in Tassie making Pinot, let alone, trying to rename the cultural identity of the region where we've had 6 generations growing up in it. I don't think I'd be allowed back into the Barossa if I started promoting Syrah.
I thought they might go the other way and say, you can't call that Shiraz.
Yeah, true. Yeah, it's sort of a compromise when I catch up with my Uncle Johnny. He doesn't want to drink Pinot. I'm like, well, have some Tassie Shiraz then.
Now, you've got a couple of big releases of a new Pinot coming out, I believe.
Yeah, so we've just released the 15 and 16 La Judith Pinots. So La Judith I created, we started the project back in 2013 with the 2013 vintage. That spent nearly 30 months in oak. So it's quite for a Tassie Pinot, it's quite big. It needs a lot of cellaring time to make it approachable. That's just getting lots of really good feedback on that wine now. So, the 15 and 16s, again, they spent around about 30 months in oak each. We only made one barrique of each of those wines as well. So 15 was quite a cool year. I wasn't so sure that, would get the intensity I needed for the Judith. But after a couple of years in oak, it's really well come together. And then the 16, conversely, was a warmer year, and we didn't. It was a funny year. We just got not over crop, but we didn't get the intensity we needed because it was too warm. And again, I didn't think that was going to make the cut. And then after a couple of years, it was 16 has been sort of an ugly duckling year for me. It was all sort of savoury and spice and no fruit. And then after a couple of years of maturity, it's this lovely sort of dark plum character has bounced right back up again. So the Judith comes off a tiny little vineyard in the Coal Valley, yields stupidly low, 1.5 to 2 tonnes per hectare. So really small bunches, very, very small berries, lots of concentration.
And is this a wine you're going to be making on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, so since 13, we've made the Judith every year, the Pinot. We do have a Shiraz under the Judith label as well. We didn't do that in 15 or 16 because it was too cold in 15. And again, the 16 vintage, it just didn't make the cut for a concentrated style.
And how does that compare with the regular Pinot in your range?
So the Rivera and the Avance, it's just got more density to it. So the tannin structure's bigger and firmer, not as bright. Even the Rivera, it's not as bright as the Rivera. It's just got this dense stewed cherry plum character. You still pick it as Pinot and you can still pick it as Tasmanian, but it's kind of something that hasn't been done before in Tassie. I mean, I was trying to create wines of power that international markets would notice.
Now, obviously, there's a real buzz around Tassie at the moment, the amount of amazing small producers doing interesting things. And what are your thoughts on what's happening in Tassie at the moment?
Yeah, it's so good. 16 years ago when my wife and I moved down here to southern Tassie, it was very quiet. There were, less than half a dozen qualified winemakers and probably only a couple of qualified viticulturalists in the south of the state. And now there'd be 30 winemakers and probably 20 viticulturalists. So, yeah, the quality of wines that's coming out of here now and the diversity is it's outstanding. And that's what cool climate areas need. 16, 17 years ago, most of the wines coming out of Tassie were made under sort of 3 contract facilities. They were good wines, but they were safe wines and they had a certain sameness to them. Now these vineyards that were previously getting made under contract are getting made by their own winemaker or themselves, and there's more love being put into the vines, more understanding. It's really good times. It's exciting as a drinker and it's exciting as being part of the industry down here to see my peers doing so well in what they're achieving. Like I said, guys like Sam Connew, the valley over, buying a vineyard that I used to source from. She's doing much better things with it than I could ever do. You got guys like Marco Lubiana, Steve Lubiana's son, who's now got his own little label coming out of the Huon, his own expression of that site. You got Sailor Seeks and Jim Chatto down in the Huon as well. Quite a tough area to farm, and they're doing pretty exciting things. Johnny Hughes down that neck of the woods as well, doing great things. And then you got guys up north, the sparkling producers coming out of the pipers, Delamere and Belbon. Yeah, we've been known to make good sparkling for a long time, but now we're making great sparkling. These tiny little houses doing, incredible stuff. It's a lot of fun. Good to see we're getting recognised as a premium area.
Great stuff. Well, congratulations on the milestone for the 2010 Mon Pere. And where can people find your wines? I guess now people can actually finally come and visit you. Yeah,
so we bought an old ice factory in the CBD of Hobart 7 or 8 years ago. Converted it into an urban winery and our tasting room. Back then, we didn't have our farm and vineyard, so there was no need to be out in the sticks. Yeah, so we're open by appointment. We've been loving having the Perth and Adelaide and Brisbane people in over the last couple of months when you guys and the Melbourne guys unfortunately weren't able to come and join us. But I reckon it's going to be a pretty busy summer while, international travel is still off the cards for a lot of people. I think Tassie is as about international as you can get.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at by James Atkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.